In philosophy, we encounter a lot of difficult problems and we get some complex arguments. In life, we get some complex arguments also, but that we can't just simply have two premises and a conclusion to get us where we want to get us to the answer that we want. So sometimes valid arguments, good arguments, bad arguments also, but good arguments come in multiple steps. Let's consider an example so you'll understand what I'm talking about. Think about this. If God does not exist, then everything is permitted. If murder is not permitted, then everything is not permitted. Murder is not permitted, therefore it's not the case that God does not exist. Somebody might give this argument to prove that God exists. Now it doesn't follow our pattern so far, right? We have three premises and a conclusion. Now let me just remind you, in an argument you need at least one premise and one statement that's a premise and one that's a conclusion. But you can have 400 million statements that are premises and one conclusion. You always only have one conclusion in an argument. If you have two, you're better off dealing with that in two different arguments. But let's see. I'm going to tell you this is actually a valid argument. Does that mean that the conclusion's true, that God exists? It's not the case that God does not exist. It's the same thing. Double negation. They cancel each other's out. God exists. Does that mean, well, we've answered one of the questions we're going to be talking about later in the semester? No. Remember, it's just valid. There's a good connection between the premises and the conclusion. That's something that we're going to have to look at. Okay, but notice, if we take the second premise, if murder is not permitted, everything is not permitted, and the third premise, murder is not permitted, from those two, using modus ponens, we can get to a conclusion. Everything is not permitted, right, by modus ponens. If P then Q, P therefore Q, valid form of inference. So we see we can get to the conclusion that everything is not permitted. Now, if we start with that in another argument and go take the first premise, if God does not exist, then everything is permitted. Everything is not permitted. We can conclude, you were supposed to answer that question. Using modus tollens, you can conclude it's not the case that God does not exist. So notice the argument on top with the three premises and the conclusion can be analyzed in terms of two smaller arguments. So we're going to find that sometimes we have multiple steps, and what we will do in that case is explain how we got that, and sometimes even cite sort of the rule of logic that we have that makes the inference valid.